You told me something about this relationship stopped making sense a while ago. Not all at once. Just small moments that stayed with you longer than they should have. You said there were things they did that didn't feel right, even though you kept telling yourself it was normal. Are you telling me you remember those moments? The way certain conversations left you quiet afterward. The way some of their reactions made you question whether you had said something wrong, even when you hadn't. You noticed it the first few times, didn't you? Look, those moments usually start small. You told me sometimes they would dismiss what you were feeling. Sometimes they would turn the conversation around until you were the one apologizing. Other times they would suddenly become distant, and you found yourself trying to fix something you couldn't even explain. You remember doing that, right? Trying to understand what you might have done differently. Replaying the conversation in your head. Wondering how something that started out feeling warm could suddenly feel so heavy. Well, I understand why you explained it the way you did. When you care about someone, it's natural to give them the benefit of the doubt. You probably told yourself they were just having a difficult day. You thought maybe the stress they were under was affecting how they spoke to you. You kept looking for the good moments, didn't you? The times when they were kind again. The moments when they said something affectionate. Those moments made it easier to believe the uncomfortable ones didn't really mean anything. But look, something inside you noticed the pattern early. You remember that feeling. The one you tried to ignore. The quiet thought that appeared for a second before you pushed it away. Are you saying that thought was already there? The thought that something about this didn't feel like love at all. You told me the first time something like this happened, you tried to brush it off. You said it didn't seem serious enough to question the whole relationship. It felt easier to assume it was just a misunderstanding. Are you saying that's how it started? A comment that didn't sit right. A reaction that felt colder than you expected. The kind of moment that makes you pause for a second and wonder if you misunderstood what just happened. Look, those moments rarely arrive with a big warning sign. Most of the time they're small. Small enough that you can explain them away without too much effort. You told yourself everyone has difficult days. You thought maybe they were under pressure. Maybe something else was bothering them. Well, I understand why that explanation felt reasonable. When you care about someone, the last thing you want to believe is that the person you love might actually be hurting you. So instead of questioning the situation, you start adjusting the way you see it. You probably told yourself the same thing many times. It's not a big deal. They didn't mean it like that. I'm probably just overthinking it. You remember doing that, don't you? Because after those uncomfortable moments, something else usually happened. They would become kind again. Maybe they apologized. Maybe they said something affectionate. Maybe they acted as if nothing had happened and the atmosphere between you suddenly felt warm again. And when that warmth returned, it made the earlier moment feel less important. Look, this is where the pattern quietly begins. The relationship starts moving between two very different experiences. One moment feels confusing or painful, and the next moment feels reassuring again. When the good moments appear, they make it easier to ignore the ones that felt wrong. You're telling me you kept focusing on those better moments. The times when they seemed loving. The moments when they said the right things. The times when you felt close again. And slowly something changes in the way you measure the relationship. Instead of asking whether the difficult moments should be happening at all, you start comparing them to the good ones. You begin telling yourself that every relationship has problems. Well, that sounds fair on the surface. But here's the part most people don't notice at first. Each time you explain away something that hurt you, the line of what you are willing to accept moves a little further. And before you realize it, the pattern is no longer occasional. It has quietly become the relationship itself. You told me that even when those moments started repeating, you still kept calling it love. Are you saying that word made the whole situation easier to explain? Look, that happens more often than people realize. When we give something a powerful name, it changes the way we see everything that follows. If we call something love, we start interpreting the difficult parts through that lens. Well, I understand why you did that. When a relationship matters to you, it's painful to imagine that the person you care about might actually be hurting you. So instead of questioning the situation itself, you start adjusting the meaning of what's happening. You probably told yourself the same things many times. Love isn't always easy. Every couple goes through difficult phases. Real love means being patient. You remember thinking that, don't you? Because those ideas make the discomfort easier to tolerate. If the painful moments are simply part of love, then there's nothing to question. You just need to be stronger, more understanding, more forgiving. And slowly that belief begins to change the way you see your own reactions. When something hurts you, you start wondering whether you're being too sensitive. When something feels wrong, you begin questioning whether you're expecting too much. Instead of asking whether the behavior itself is acceptable, you begin examining yourself. Look, this is where the illusion becomes powerful. The label, love, starts protecting the situation from being examined too closely. It becomes the explanation that makes everything else seem normal. But here's the part that most people only see much later. Love doesn't require you to shrink yourself just to keep the peace. Love doesn't repeatedly make you question your own feelings. Love doesn't leave you constantly trying to earn the kindness that should already be there. And once you begin looking at the situation without that label covering everything, something uncomfortable becomes visible. The thing you were calling love may have been something very different all along. You told me something started changing once you stopped focusing only on the good moments. Not because those moments disappeared, but because you finally began looking at the whole picture instead of the pieces that made the relationship easier to justify. Look, that shift usually happens quietly. At first it's just a thought you can't ignore anymore. The kind that appears after another conversation that leaves you feeling smaller instead of supported. The kind that stays with you long after the moment is over. Are you telling me you started noticing that feeling more often? You began remembering things differently. Situations you once explained away suddenly looked clearer when you thought about them again. Words that used to sound confusing started making sense when you stopped trying to defend them. Well, that's usually when the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You're telling me the same situations kept repeating. The same arguments. The same dismissive reactions. The same moments where you felt like you had to prove that your feelings were valid. You remember those conversations, don't you? Look, once you stop calling something love, the situation starts revealing itself much more honestly. The things you once interpreted as passion begin to look like control. The things you once called misunderstanding begin to look like dismissal. The things you once described as difficult moments begin to look like a pattern. And I understand why that realization can feel unsettling. Because the moment you see the pattern clearly, you can't go back to the explanation that protected you before. The story you told yourself no longer fits the evidence in front of you. So instead of asking yourself how to make the relationship work, you begin asking a different question. You begin asking what the situation has actually been doing to you. Look carefully at what you noticed. How often you felt anxious before certain conversations. How often you tried to explain your feelings only to end up apologizing for them. How often you adjusted yourself just to keep the peace. You're telling me you started seeing those moments as connected. And once they connect, something becomes very clear. This wasn't love behaving badly. It was something else wearing the name of love. You told me something feels different now when you look at the situation. Not because the relationship suddenly changed, and not because the other person finally explained everything. It feels different because you're no longer looking at it through the same word. Look, once you stop calling something love, the whole situation begins to look clearer. You're telling me the same moments that once felt confusing now seem much easier to understand. The conversations that used to leave you questioning yourself start making sense when you look at them honestly. The things you once defended begin to look like the very things that were hurting you. You remember noticing that shift, don't you? At first it feels strange. For a long time that one word explained everything. It was the reason you stayed patient. The reason you kept forgiving. The reason you kept believing things would eventually change. Well, I understand why that word held so much power. If something is love, then the difficult parts are supposed to be worth it. If something is love, then the pain must mean the relationship is important enough to fight for. But look carefully at what you're seeing now. You're telling me the pattern doesn't look the same anymore. The moments that once felt like passion now look like control. The things that once seemed like misunderstandings now look like dismissal. And once you see that clearly, something else becomes impossible to ignore. You can't pretend the pattern isn't there. The question stops being whether this is love. The question becomes what you are willing to accept in your life. Look, that's not a decision anyone else can make for you. Because the moment you stop calling something love, you begin deciding what love should actually look like in your life. If you decide to